from the conversations I've had and some of the literature I've read, the reason for voter turnout, low voter turnout, is the common thing I'm hearing over and over and over again is that, well, my vote doesn't count. That seems to be the general answer I get and see in literature over and over.
Yeah, and that could also reflect the Electoral College to some degree. I mean, if you got rid of the Electoral College, then everybody's vote would count equally. You wouldn't have swing states and so forth. I'm just looking at Mark Lewis's question. There are two questions. Prior to 2000, has a presidential election been litigated? And has a president ever refused to leave office? Well, there have been very contested elections. The election of 1800 and the election, well, the election of 1800 is one that stands out. And that was contested really because the Constitution hadn't taken into account the possibilities of political parties. So when Jefferson and Aaron Burr ran together on the same platform, they both achieved the same amount of votes. And so there was a contest that went into Congress then to decide who would be president of the United States, and went through many iterations of bargaining before Jefferson was finally awarded the presidency. Something, so that wasn't in the law courts, it wasn't litigated in that sense, but it was highly contested. And I guess in the modern parlance, you would say it was a stress tested the Constitution or something along those lines. Has a president ever refused to leave office? No, not as far as I know.
Contemporary elections, I can't think of an election prior to 2000, as far back even as 30s, 40s, and 50s and up. I can't think of an election being litigated in court. And also, I have never heard of a US president ever refusing to leave office. And from a lot of what I'm reading in the Washington Post and the New York Times, a lot of people are asking, what do you do if the president refuses to leave? Come January 20th, if he's refusing to leave, and Joe Biden is not sworn in, who becomes the president? Well, that would be Nancy Pelosi at that point. But I've never heard of a president refusing to leave office.
Yeah, well the 2000 is a good reference point, because that would have been the opportunity for Al Gore to keep things going in the courts, and to push it further. And he, stepped down before it went that far.
Yeah, and going back to 2000, as those ballots were being recounted, Bush's lead was narrowing, and then the Supreme Court halted it. And about a year or so after the election, all ballots are destroyed. So we'll never know who, if Gore really did win that election or not. But you're right, that would have been a good test at that point for Al Gore to really keep that going, and we can see how that would have turned out.
So the Supreme Court and the presidential election. 2000 is the only case I know where the Supreme Court was drawn into the presidential election. But the election of the president obviously has a huge impact on the Supreme Court. So there's it's often said the current Supreme Court is the most conservative court that there has been since the so-called four horsemen of the apocalypse were on the Supreme Court in the 30s, and preventing FDR from pushing through some of his New Deal laws or overturning some of FDR's New Deal laws. And FDR at that point threatened to pack the courts, threatened to put in place age restrictions that would get rid, essentially put in age caps that would get rid some of the older Supreme Court judges so we could fill those seats, but also to create new seats. And the Constitution allows for that. The Constitution gives Congress, the Constitution says Congress will create a Supreme Court, but it doesn't say what form that Supreme Court will take. Mm-hmm. So it's really left up to Congress through the Judiciary Act or some other act to determine how many judges will be on the Supreme Court. So FDR was within his constitutional rights to do that, but politically he couldn't get it through. But he ended up effectively changing the courts because he had so many terms as president that by the end of by his death, he had managed to replace the Supreme Court justices and turn what had been a very conservative court into a much more liberal court. And that in many ways helped to enable the civil rights movement that followed. It put in place a shift from a conservative court to a more liberal court, and that more liberal court was then able to pass Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, and so on. So the relationship between elections between the president and the Supreme Court and the legal system is obviously very tight and complicated.
You know, I want to add to that too. An interesting, when FDR attempted to pack the court, although that failed, the fact that he tried to do it, you would then see a change in the court's position in ruling on some of his New Deal legislation after that. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if the threat of Joe Biden, should he be elected, threatening to pack the court might even shift the view that this current court might be taking. Maybe they may not be as far conservative as, they're thought to be. That's food for thought. Also, another thing you mentioned, some of the groundbreaking cases in the 1950s on civil rights. It's also worth noting that Earl Warren, who had been appointed by Eisenhower, somewhat of a political favorite of Richard Nixon, he was also the architect in California for the Japanese internment camps. Yet the same man in the 1950s is ruling on some groundbreaking legislation that's just changing the shape of America, from that point forward. So we have another question here. What are your thoughts on the theory that Congress actually has the final say in who becomes president? But don't we see that in the election with John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, the whole idea of a corrupt bargain?
1824.
1824.
Yeah, so I mean that again is in the Constitution. If the electoral college, if somebody doesn't win an electoral college majority, then it falls into Congress, and with the House of Representatives determining the president and the Senate determining the vice president. So, it's there in the rules of the game. The corrupt bargain backfired, essentially. I mean, John Quincy Adams was a one-term president and is succeeded by Jackson then in 1828, and Jackson was able to leverage this idea that the 1824 had been to delegitimize the election of 1824 as a corrupt bargain, and then swing into power in 1828 and 1832 and put in place this Jacksonian reforms, the Jacksonian era. Yeah.
Well, Henry Clay was also he was running, and he was the Speaker of the House. And when the election went, because none of the candidates got enough of the electoral votes to win, so when the election goes to the House of Representatives, the corrupt bargain was Henry Clay became Secretary of State, which in those days wasn't Secretary of the State almost like the springboard to eventually become president?
Sorry. Yeah, so there was a tradition. Jefferson, for instance, had been Secretary of State before he became president. And Jackson, if I remember correctly, won the larger
Yes.
vote tally in 1824. So again, he was able to leverage that. But I mean, it was a very, very rough, dirty political environment with a lot of slander being thrown backwards and forwards.
Jackson's wife, I think, was
Yeah,
brought into it.
Jackson's
The
wife,
widow.
and you know, so starting in the 1790s, going well into into the 19th century and beyond, it was customary for people to throw out, circulate stories, slanderous stories in the press,
Mm-hmm.
some of which were true. For instance, Jefferson having children with Sally Hemings, his slave, was something that was thrown at him as a political, for political reasons, but we now know through DNA was actually true.
Right. All right. We're just at about 3:30. Maybe we should start just wrapping it up.
Okay.
If anyone has any final question they'd like to ask, if not, I guess we could just call it a wrap.
Okay, well, thank you to everyone for participating. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, John.
And I hope it's helped people think about the election that's coming around on Tuesday, and also about the relationship between that election and American history more broadly.
Yes, thank you. And regardless of who your candidate is, just please go out and vote. Thank you.